After a very long explanation of how the different compounds, farms, and towns were all coming together as a community, and of course explaining where everybody was, we were able to convince the elves that they needed to come and talk with everybody, as there is strength in numbers, and they had children to protect. They were hesitant, but it took a long time, and we had nothing but time. I had time because I needed my wings to recover. They still hurt. Every once in a while, I would move them just a little bit, and every once in a while, you would hear a small crack or pop as the joints themselves were beginning to be a little tight. My regeneration ability is good, but it's got its limits. We finally were able to come to a consensus that they would be able to come to a town meeting. I offered 1 week from that day, but they said no, it would have to be 2 weeks. I asked why, and they said they still had some work to do. I had no idea what it was, but I realized that they were going to keep much of their area secret. If I had to guess, they were going to start to upgrade or reinforce something so that it wouldn't be very easy if we came back and tried to take their supplies. They realized that we could simply drop in unannounced, quite literally, but that wasn't our intention. As a sign of good faith, we actually tried to leave them with something, but I didn't have anything else on me except a little bit of my lunch that was left over. With that, I let them know that we were able to take care of ourselves and we had no interest in their supplies. Our interest was strength as a community, strength in numbers, and strength in different species. Having to remind them that they are elves, though their senses are quite high, they're still basically human. Well, basically. With that, I could see at least one of the females there lowered her wings just a little bit as she was contemplating the idea of being human again. I didn't push the subject after that. Eventually, my wings healed enough to fly, and we had already made significant progress. And as we took off, I waved bye to everybody. I used my tail a little bit to wave by, but they didn't understand that that's something us lizards do. They only have one in their group that actually has a tail, so they really didn't quite understand it yet. As we fly, a few of the females start suggesting different things and getting very handsy as we fly. Though it stopped abruptly as one of them tried to caress my wings and I basically yelped in pain. It was difficult just for me to stretch my wings, let alone hold them into position. I was not exactly happy. I told them that we still need to do some scouting, so in a couple of days I would come and we would actually do a patrol, as we had to expand the territory and find out what the hell was going on. This cabin had been here for what, months? And I didn't even notice. I just happened across it. It's very well camouflaged, even from the sky. So if that's the case, we had to know what was about. We had to know if there were any new neighbors. We had to know everything. We were still in a state of war, basically. We didn't know what type of trouble was going to be coming over the hills or through the valleys, up the rivers, or flying in. We had no idea. So we had to be ready. And everyone who's been in a combat situation knows information is ammunition. After returning home, I had to tell everybody what happened. They were more than a little interested to meet actual elves. They thought it would be kind of interesting to see their ears. They thought for a moment it was going to be like that pointy eared guy that you could see in that god awful sci fi show. But no, I had to tell them it was more akin to video games. And for the love of God, don't pull on them. Apparently, their ears are a bit sensitive. Reminds me of another sci fi show. My girls wanted to celebrate that night, but I had to tell them, please, please don't touch me. They were a little put back at this and thought I had been pissed off at them for some reason, but no, I was just still in a lot of pain. Though my body was regenerating, it would take a long time. Think of if you ever bruise yourself and you just don't ever want to touch that spot. Well, that was most of my body at that point. Even if I laid on my back and just let them do whatever they wanted to do, I'd be wincing in pain the entire time. In fact, I had to walk around for my patrol that night, as I, of course, wasn't even close to tired. 2 days later, I met up with the female fliers and we went on patrol. We decided to extend as far as we could, but we would be flying in a formation. I'd be up front, as I had the strongest wings, and I could cut the air enough so that the resistance wasn't going to hurt them much. They didn't understand this until we actually got in formation and then started to say how it was so much easier, this flying V we were in. And because it was so much easier, they could actually get more altitude a lot faster. That was a good thing because one of the areas we needed to check was on the other side of the mountain from where they live. The valley where those bugs had fought themselves to death, and where one had tried to bite my tail off, the little bastards. I still was thinking if there's any there, I'm definitely going to kill them. Hell, just the thought of that thing biting on and not letting go even after I ripped its head off, ugh, sends a shiver from the tip of my tail all the way to the back of my neck. It's just, ah. We were going to take our time, but then we heard shots, so we had to rush our way up there. This was kind of difficult as we had to break formation to deal with the wind shear that comes over that mountain. We tried as best we could to glide our way across. Most of us can't flap our wings to fly, but we can glide very well. As we began to clear the ridgeline, we saw down into the valley where those corpses was just covered in webbing. Yes, webbing. I thought for a little bit, this looks like when the gypsy moths took over from when I was a kid. The whole place was covered in webs. But this looks denser, thicker, and definitely more deliberate. What the hell is going on? The bodies themselves were completely covered, and in some cases they looked like they were encased, wrapped up completely as though the bodies were being preserved. We began to hear more shots off in the distance. These seemed random, but then they started to build up slowly. We decided to bank over and get closer and closer to the shots, and pretty soon, through the trees, we saw an old logging road, and we saw several vehicles on it. What we saw coming out of there was surprising. There was a bunch of 20 and 30-year-olds coming out of the vehicles, a mix of men and women, many of them decked out in very extravagant clothing. The clothing was clearly not appropriate for off in the woods, as many of the women had basically mink coats on. Though the mink coats looked like they'd been through a blender and were covered in dirt, they still wore them. For a moment I thought they were part bear, but nope. With that, I looked a little closer, my eyes able to zoom in a little bit more, and I could see these weren't militia. These were basic survivors, but what the hell? No, they have a different term. These were marauders. All I saw in the vehicles was a bunch of firearms, and the men who jumped out were covered in tattoos. Oichi mama. I told the girls that we would be heading in. We started to move over towards the vehicles, and we could see different movement inside the webbing itself. It's though from the surface we could see things crawling inside the webbing. We couldn't make out exactly what it was, and we weren't going to get all that close. But as we did, we saw that these things were moving around towards where the gang members were. The gang members had stopped as some of the webbing had crossed the road, and one of the trucks had tried to ram through and decided to get totally stuck. It wasn't going anywhere. Looks like whoever was inside threw it in reverse, tried to pull out, but it was in there fully. Then we saw them. We saw them being fired at from the trucks and from the other vehicles. The gang members were taking pot shots at any movement. We saw what was inside. Spiders. Well, sort of, I think. I've dealt with spiders before, and they just left you alone. You didn't mess with their webbing. They didn't deal with you at all. But we saw that there was a lot more. Last time I dealt with some, it was, what, 5, 6 of them? Now it seemed like there was about 10 to 15. Did they get more? Did they breed? What the hell was going on? As we were flying around trying to get a good look, our angel actually showed up with a rifle, and this surprised the living hell out of me. She got close, and I told her what was going on, and she actually, with extreme efficiency, which surprised the hell out of me, she snapped the safety off and put her finger next to the trigger well. Next, not into. I looked, and I would have smiled, but I couldn't, of course. I did give her a thumbs up on that one. As we began to move in, we decided to get to the back side. We noticed that a few were yelling and pointing at us, but we were so far out that shots weren't going to reach us. One of them tried to take a pot shot and it just went wild. I didn't even hear the whistle or the whiz of the bullet as it went by. Whoever was firing clearly had no idea how his weapons were going to work at that distance. The gang members, desperate, started bringing out some sort of torch and started burning the webs. This seemed to work on the webbing, although I wouldn't exactly want to use a blowtorch or whatever that whole thing was, the spaceball flamethrower, anywhere near a vehicle. You'd think the fuel tank would catch on fire. From inside the webbing, though, we heard something. Something that made my tail spike straight out. We heard children scream. We heard women scream. And at that point, I stopped thinking. My instincts kicked in, the same instincts every man has to protect the women and the children. And with that, there was no consideration. I just banked down, tucked my wings back so I had just enough control as I let gravity take over, and I was on full attack. As we got close, I pulled my insect blades, thankful that I still had some, and headed right down towards them. I came to the back side of their formation and aimed for the closest one that had a firearm. I came up close and took his freaking head off, slicing clean through the neck. The next one turned around, hearing what was going on, but as he turned, I drove the blade into his chest, and then I swooped around as fast as I could, still maintaining my flight. As all those realized that I was there, they began to turn their rifles towards me. Then a couple shots came at them, and they could hear the shots hitting next to them. Though none of them were actually shot, this was enough to make them duck, and this was enough for my other friends to show up. Like the man says, you show up to a firefight, bring a gun, then bring all your friends with guns, and then bring more guns. Well, we didn't have guns, but what we did have was teeth, claws, and the ability to ambush them. We came in as fast as we could, dodging and weaving, trying to stay away from the webbing, and then we would drop down, using our claws to rip into them. Many of the women screamed as they went and pulled out pistols from underneath their coats. I looked and I ducked over towards one of the females. She was not wearing armor. I moved over, tried to use as much of my bug armor as possible, and it bounced off the arm guard. Oh, thank God I reinforced that thing, I thought, as the bullet bounced off, but it was enough concussion that it actually knocked my fist into my face. Oh, great, why am I hitting myself? With that, we continued our assault. With that, we also were able to take one of the vehicles. The women backed up, of course, but they were screaming in different languages, languages I never did bother to learn. Well, there was English in there too, but mostly it was curse words. The men, however, were a complete disorganized mess, firing desperately into each area. I even saw one of them as he turned the corner of his vehicle, a large SUV. He turned his weapon up and fired, and then realized that he just shot his buddy in the face. Yeah, real smart dude. As he turned around, I was standing right there. I knocked the weapon out of his hand with one swipe, taking one of his hands off at the same time with my talons. And before he realized what was going on, one of the females came in with her foot talons and drove right into his side, and one of the talons going right into his neck. The spray of blood from his carotid artery actually made me have to turn my head, or else I'd get some of it in my eyes. The battle was over soon after that, but not before we saw something very interesting. Some of them had backed up towards the webbing, which was a very big mistake. Suddenly, legs jumped out, arms jumped out, teeth came out, and of course webs shot out, grabbing them and dragging them in. We saw one of them get pulled in, screaming, firing up in the air desperately as their arm was wrapped up with some sort of sticky fluid. And then suddenly we saw what had caught it. It was an arachnid for sure, but this was different from what I'd seen before. Similar, but definitely not the same. With some of the spider-type legs, it wrapped this guy up extremely quickly, so fast I couldn't even follow some of the legs as they moved. He was extremely efficient. He was still on the ground, trying to break free desperately, firing his weapon through the webbing, but the heat of the weapon itself didn't exactly cut through that easy. But as it started to, another one of the arachnids showed up, this one much more arachnid style. Came up and drove their fangs right into the abdomen, and with a muffled scream, the body went limp. All this happened in less than 15 seconds. We were all amazed at this, and with that, the last of the gang members were trying desperately to run away. We're not going to let them. They had just fired at us. We were just going to watch, but you decided to do something really, really stupid, pal. They didn't get far. The one running the farthest dropped his weapon, screeching into the forest himself, and as I caught up to him, I saw that particular 2 letters and 2 numbers tattooed on his face. I had to laugh as I raised my claws up and ripped right across his face, ripping most of his face off, but he was still alive. With that, I looked up and I laughed again. He must have been in complete shock, not knowing what was going on. Missing his eyelids, he looked right at me. And I looked over at him and said, I know what you do. I know what type of people you are. And with that, I raised my foot and crushed it right into his groin as hard as I could, crushing everything that was there, the pelvic bone, the muscles, and anything they were attached to. And with a screech into the woods, I shoved him down with my other hand and then slowly squeezed the life out of him. Oh, did I mention I have a thing against gang members? Yeah, I do. After the whole attack, we pulled all the bodies together and began to throw them next to the vehicles. I then looked over to the webbing. The spiders had disappeared, but we could see they were still there. There were still movements around. We could hear voices that seemed to talk to each other. And I simply yelled out, "Who's in charge?" We waited then. We waited as we also started to go through their gear. Our angel was a little put back at the absolute destruction, the fact that the rest of us lizard folks, are covered in blood, as we had to get personal. We don't have the appendages able to handle a firearm. Yet she was a little more relieved when I began to pull out different medical equipment, to include a vial of penicillin and several syringes. She was beyond content with this, yet I had to remind her that the fact that this thing was not refrigerated meant it might not be any good. She was still elated at this, as she went through more of the medical and found all sorts of antibiotics, mostly fish pills, and was absolutely ecstatic at more and more that they found. Wherever these guys had just raided, they had done a good job tearing it apart. There was nothing in there that wasn't practical for purpose, except for what many of them were wearing. Seriously, who in the hell goes out in the woods in a white tank top looking wife beater thing? What the hell is wrong with these guys anyway? Well, it doesn't matter anymore. Eventually, we heard something from the webbing. They weren't trying to be quiet. Something came out. Something rather large. It stood there, coming out of the webs itself. We could see there were others behind it, but it came out alone. The shape, the shape was much more human. The fact that it still had a few insectoid appendages made many of us a little nervous. We haven't had good luck with insects. However, we looked over and, well, she definitely had been dining on some human. Either that or she didn't change like the others I'd seen before. The different appendages, were there specifically to deal with the silk. But aside from that, again, curvature of human. I asked if she was hungry and maybe we could talk over dinner as I motioned towards the bodies. Unfortunately, our angel was about ready to vomit at the idea. She had never ingested human at all the entire time, nor was she truly susceptible to the sleep. We worried about this. Maybe something else happened to her, but it wasn't time for that. The queen simply pulled forward, looked at us, and simply asked a question. Are you here to hunt us too? We laughed at that. If we were here to hunt you, you'd already be dead, said one of my lizard ladies as she chuckled at the idea that we had just gone through all that and that we were going to pick another fight. I don't think so. After fully introducing ourselves, I simply asked, "Are you the Queen Mother, or is it different?" She chuckled at this idea, as there was no actual queen. It was more along the lines of who was the strongest was the one who was told to go out and talk to us. Though she did say she wasn't exactly in need of food. I had to laugh as I informed her I knew what was under all this webbing. I was the one that split open the sides. She was a little mad at that, as that made preservation of what eggs were on the ground very difficult. In fact, it was almost impossible, and they had to gorge themselves on the ones that spilled on the ground, or else they would have gone bad. The idea of them eating the eggs was enough for most of us to almost be off our appetite. Almost. She then stated how she had been forced to ingest human as she didn't have anything to eat, and then she had changed into, as she said, this right here, as she waved her hands up and down her body. Her stature was clearly that of feminine, as it was clear she had been eaten almost exclusively female. She had to have been. Her proportions were adequate for someone who stood about 10 feet tall. We still offered her to join us if she wanted. However, the first thing she did was grab a hold of the closest male and actually open up a very large maw to take a bite. And then I told her, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, you might not want to do that. Not if you want to look that good." She looked surprised. And then we actually explained what we had discovered about the different sexes to be eaten. If that was the case, if she had eaten nothing but male, she might become hermaphroditic, or completely male in the process. We're not exactly sure, but no one really wants to push the subject. The fact that I'm pretty much the only male there definitely threw them all off. However, as it turns out, I wasn't the only male. Several different young boys actually came out. If I had to judge the age, I'd judge the ages from about 5 to maybe 7. They weren't old. They came out and offered to actually consume some of them as they were getting bored with eating nothing but the insect bodies. Though I did find out as we talked that to them it was like eating ice cream. But there's only so many times you can eat ice cream before you just want a hamburger. This was understandable, as we all decided to dine. However, our angel was absolutely disgusted and decided to regurgitate on the other side of the vehicle. I told her to do a quick inventory, but please keep your ears open in case she wants to join the conversation. We talked to the queen as more and more of them came out to say hi. The differences in these arachnid was absolutely astounding. Very few of them were what you would think, being half spider and half human. No, many of them were an amalgamation of the two. One of them having a strange split lip and pincers on the side of her cheeks, yet she also had the legs coming out of her sides, but the rest of her was completely human, at least from what I could see. Well, that and she didn't have any hair. She was almost completely carapace, but then again, it was also covered in skin. I don't know how else to explain it. I mean, it wasn't scales like me. Then I saw another that was exactly a split. It was odd. The youngest ones, though, didn't seem to be as much arachnid as they were human. It was odd to see. As we sat and ate, many of us talked about the differences that we had gone through, the changes, and of course the sleep. As it turns out, yes, they go into a hibernation as well, but their bodies will naturally build a cocoon around themselves, and then they'll hatch, almost like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. It was strange. Unfortunately, in some cases, they're not able to actually break out of their own cocoons. They need to make sure that they go in with some sort of cutting tool to get out, as sometimes their body is actually weaker going out than it is going in. But it is more human. We did have to ask if they ate the bugs, then how could they not be changing into bugs? They told us that eating insects doesn't change us. It wouldn't change you. I was confused. Now, we had to inform them that we just don't eat the bugs. I turned to all the others and they simply shook their head vehemently, saying they would absolutely not eat it. With that, one of the younger ones asked why. They taste good. Not to us, I said, very, very vehemently as I stared into his eyes. He was confused at this, but continued to eat his snack as he began to scarf down a leg, actually opening up his mouth and sucking down the whole thing almost like a stream of spaghetti. With that, I was a little put back, but I continued with my own meal. Having one or two of these guys was going to be good, I thought. That is, until I realized that the ink from the tattoos was absolutely disgusting. The fact that I had burned a lot of calories was the only reason I was enjoying what I was eating. Aside from that, I was trying desperately not to vomit. I knew this was going to give me a whole bunch of trouble later, especially since these were probably prison tattoos, and they use a lot of lead inside those things. It's actually horrible. I could taste the metal. It was disgusting. Though the more I was disgusted by the flavor, the more I was glad I killed these pieces of garbage. I tried to hide my displeasure, but not everybody was able to do so. In fact, they were just about ready to throw the skin away when I reminded them if they actually go into the sleep after eating skin, they might get more delicate skin and be more human. They hesitantly began to eat even more. Although, once you get going, it's kind of hard to stop. It's like potato chips that way. As we finished up, I brought up the fact that we were trying to actually set up our own community, and since they were clearly non aggressive to us, and again, strength in numbers, we wanted to see if they wanted to join. We brought up the benefits of trade and protection, and of course, there was no way we were going to cross over their boundaries as long as they didn't cross over into ours. They then began to ask what we would have to trade. Well, since we don't eat bugs, we could definitely drop off any that we catch. We haven't seen any in a while since we dealt with the wasp nest. They immediately perked up. Wasp nest? They were actually worried about that. As it turns out, wasps had actually showed up. One of the queens had actually grabbed a few of them, but it didn't kill her. It had implanted an egg. They couldn't get the egg out in time. The egg itself immediately started dissolving her insides, and pretty soon she died a very slow and painful death. That whole situation simmered for a while we all contemplated it, but I immediately jumped in and said, "This is why you need good neighbors." She looked at me, and I swear she smiled. Not that I could tell much on her face. I mean, her arachnoid portions were making it difficult for her to emote, but still, it was interesting to see. Eventually, after I showed a basic map as I basically just drew it out on the ground, the queen and the others realized that they were pretty far out from everybody else, though they were not so far out that they couldn't get help. Somebody would have to actually crawl across the mountain itself to actually come and see us. So she agreed. She agreed to meet the others. I wondered how everything would go over. Thankfully, we have a few here who could talk to everybody, and we'd let them know what to expect, or who, what, yeah, what to expect was coming to the meeting. Eventually, it came down to how we were going to split the spoils, and our wonderful new neighbors didn't have much interest in what was there. A little bit in some small items like a canteen and things of that nature, but they really didn't need much, nor did they want much. They had their own little community there. With this, we bid them adieu after splitting the spoils up. I couldn't drive anything. I would have to actually bring someone over to drive, but we knew that full vehicles with multiple cans of fuel, ammo, weapons, food, medical supplies, it was all here. Everything we would need to just make things better. We knew we'd have to break this apart based on how many personnel, but eventually, nobody even thought to argue about it. With this, we eventually parted ways and we all scattered. As our wonderful angel took off in one direction, the other flyers, like me, who couldn't exactly flap our wings, we had to slowly work our way around, catching air pockets to try and get more and more elevation. We saw the arachnids watching us, as we went up. It's though they were just interested on the fact that we could fly. I wondered if they were making any sort of nefarious plans, but the fact that we had fought on the same side and protected each other, well, that put my mind at ease just a little bit more. Eventually, we started getting to the ridge line, and I felt it. I felt the sleep. Oh, crap. With this, I told the girls what was going on, and my wonderful lady lizards were feeling the same thing. They did offer to go and tell the elves what was going on and who was coming to their meeting, but aside from that, we all had to go back. I was looking forward to the meeting. I was looking forward to the council. I just hope that in the 12 days until the meeting itself, I'm actually conscious. And then another thought hit me. Will they even recognize me? Is there another change coming? Oh, God. Oh, my stomach's rumbling now. Okay. Gotta move this cloth, oh, okay. Yeah, the tattoos aren't settling. Oh, Lord. Oh, Lord. Oh, not only am I tired, but look out below.